I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. I had always loved being outdoors. The quiet, the fresh air, the escape from daily life. I wasn't some survival expert, but I knew how to handle myself. I'd gone on plenty of solo camping trips before, so when I decided to take a weekend trip out to a secluded area in the mountains, I didn't think much of it. I had found the spot online, on a forum where people shared hidden gems for camping. It was deep in a national forest, far from any official campgrounds. No facilities, no marked trails, just raw wilderness. Exactly what I was looking for. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a knife, flashlight, extra batteries. I even brought a small GPS device just in case. I wasn't stupid. I knew how easy it was to get lost out there. The drive was long. The last stretch nothing but a narrow dirt road winding through thick trees. I hadn't seen another car for over an hour by the time I reached a small clearing where I could park. From there, it was a 2-mile hike to the spot I had picked. The trail was barely visible, just a faint path through the undergrowth. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant sounds of traffic, no other hikers, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Took me about 40 minutes to reach the site. It was beautiful, an open clearing with soft grass, surrounded by tall trees, with a small creek running nearby. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the trees for some shade, but far enough to have a clear view of my surroundings. I gathered some firewood, set up my little cooking stove, and sat down to eat as the sun dipped lower. That's when I first felt it. It wasn't anything obvious, just a strange unease, like I was being watched. I looked around, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just the thick woods, the fading light casting long shadows. I shook it off. It was normal to feel a little on edge when you were completely alone in the wild. By the time it was fully dark, I had a fire going. The crackling flames were comforting, pushing back the night. I stared into them, letting my mind wander. Then I heard it, a sound from the woods, a soft, deliberate snap, like a footstep on a dry branch. I tensed, listening. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air. But beyond that, nothing. I turned on my flashlight and aimed it at the trees. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating trunks and branches, but no movement. No animals darting away, just silence. I forced myself to relax. It was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I told myself that over and over. Still, I kept my knife close as I climbed into my tent that night. I barely slept. Every little sound outside made my eyes snap open. The wind through the trees, the rustle of leaves. I swore I heard footsteps at one point. Slow, careful, circling my campsite. I held my breath, gripping my knife so tightly my hand hurt. But nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted off into a light, uneasy sleep. Morning came slowly. The fire had burned out, leaving only blackened wood and cold ash. The air was crisp, the sky pale blue. I forced myself to shake off the night's paranoia. It was a new day. I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin the trip. I made breakfast, packed a small bag, and set out to explore. The woods were dense, but the creek made for a good landmark. I followed it upstream, weaving through the trees, enjoying the quiet. Birds chirped, the water gurgled over rocks. It was peaceful, but as I hiked farther from camp, that feeling crept back in. The sense of being watched. I stopped, looking around slowly. Nothing but trees and undergrowth. The wind moved through the leaves, making them whisper. I took a deep breath and kept walking. An hour later, I found something strange. A small clearing like my own campsite, but different. In the center, a fire pit, long cold, surrounded by stones. Beside it, a rough wooden structure like a lean-to half collapsed. Someone had camped here recently, but there were no signs of gear, no backpack, no tent. Just the fire pit and the old shelter. And something else. Something that made my stomach turn. Hanging from a tree branch nearby, a bundle of sticks, tied together with twine. It was small, about the size of my hand, carefully arranged like some kind of symbol. I stared at it, my skin crawling. Felt wrong. I turned and walked away quickly, back toward my campsite. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some hunter had camped there. Maybe the bundle was just, I don't know, a marker? A joke? But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I should have left, but I didn't. I spent the rest of the day close to camp, trying to enjoy the last bit of my trip. I read, cooked, watched the creek flow by. But as the sun set, the unease grew stronger. When night fell, I made sure my fire was bigger than before. I sat close to it, my back to my tent, watching the trees. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Then, a sound. Not far. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy moving through the leaves. My breath caught in my throat. I turned, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The beam shook slightly as I held it. Then I saw it. A figure, just beyond the light's reach, standing still, too still. I couldn't see a face, just the outline. A person, tall, thin, barely visible between the trees. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. My mind raced. Who the hell was that? Why were they out here, alone in the dark? I took a slow step back toward my tent, never looking away. The figure didn't move. Then, a second figure, farther back in the trees. Another person standing just as still. The fire crackled beside me, its warmth suddenly meaningless. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I turned, grabbed my knife and my keys, and backed toward my car. I didn't run. I didn't want to trigger anything. I reached my car, yanked the door open, and got inside, locking it immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the trees ahead. No one. Nothing. I sat there for a few seconds, breathing hard. Then, without hesitation, I put the car in reverse and tore out of there. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing. I wasn't supposed to be there. I don't know why I remember this so clearly. It's been years since it happened, but sometimes, late at night, when everything is too quiet, I find myself back there in my mind. The thick trees, the endless dark, the feeling of being watched. I don't think I'll ever forget it. It started as a simple camping trip. Nothing special. Just a weekend out in the woods, away from work, away from everything. I wasn't a total rookie. I'd been camping a handful of times before, but I wouldn't call myself an expert either. I just wanted some peace and quiet. I picked a spot I found online. It was about 4 hours from home, deep in a national forest, but supposedly easy to get to. A dirt road led close enough to the site that I'd only have to hike about a mile to reach it. That sounded perfect. Isolated, but not impossible to get back to my car if needed. I packed everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, food, a knife just in case, a flashlight, extra batteries. My phone had no signal out there, but I didn't care. That was kind of the point. I left early in the morning and drove out, the roads becoming emptier the farther I went. By the time I turned onto the dirt road, I hadn't seen another car for almost an hour. That should have been my first warning sign. The road was rough, full of potholes and loose gravel, but my SUV handled it fine. After about 15 minutes, I found a small clearing to park. I grabbed my gear, locked up the car, and started walking. The trail was narrow but well-worn. Tall trees stretched high above me, their thick branches blocking out most of the sky. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No cars, no distant voices, just the sound of my boots crunching on dirt and the occasional chirp of birds. After about 20 minutes, I reached my campsite. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by trees, with a view of a lake just a short walk away. The air was crisp, the water calm. I set up my tent near the tree line, laid out my sleeping bag, and got a fire going. By the time I finished eating, the sun was already starting to set. The sky turned a deep orange, then faded to dark blue. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The light was low, and shadows stretched across the trees. But no, I was sure. Across the lake, maybe 50 yards away, A woman stood at the edge of the water. She was barefoot, her clothes loose and ragged, her hair hanging in front of her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the lake. I felt a strange unease crawl up my spine. I told myself she was just another camper. Maybe she had a sight farther into the woods. Maybe she was enjoying the view like I was. But something about her felt wrong. She didn't look around, didn't adjust her posture. She just stood there, perfectly still. I tried to ignore it. After a while, I turned back to my fire, focused on the warmth, the flickering flames. But every few minutes, I glanced back. She hadn't moved. I told myself it was fine. She was probably just enjoying the quiet. But as darkness fully settled, my nerves started to get the better of me. I finally stood up, stretched, and stepped closer to the water. The lake was calm, the air still, but she was gone. I scanned the shoreline, squinting in the dim light, but she wasn't there anymore. The unease in my gut twisted into something sharper. I shook it off. She had probably just walked back to her own camp. Still, I kept my knife close as I crawled into my tent that night. Sleep didn't come easy. The forest made all kinds of sounds. Branches creaking, leaves rustling, distant animal calls. But there was something else too, a soft crunching, like footsteps, slow, careful. I held my breath, listening. The sound circled my tent, stopping, then starting again. I gripped my knife tight, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won. My eyes grew heavy, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning came, bright and normal, as if nothing had happened. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints. They circled my tent. Bare footprints. My stomach knotted. I forced myself to take slow breaths. Maybe it was my own paranoia. Maybe the woman had been lost, looking for help. I almost convinced myself of that, until I found something else. Near the tree line, just behind my tent, was a pile of rocks. Not a random scatter, deliberate. A small stack placed carefully. My skin went cold. That hadn't been there before. I needed to leave. I packed up fast, stuffing everything into my bag without care. I didn't even bother eating. I just wanted to get back to my car. The hike back felt different. The trees seemed thicker, the shadows deeper. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder. I didn't see anything, but I felt something. Then, halfway to my car, I saw her again, standing just off the trail, half hidden behind a tree. Closer this time. I didn't stop. I didn't run either. I just kept walking, heart pounding, hands sweaty around the straps of my bag. She didn't move. She just watched. I finally reached my car, fumbling with the keys, throwing my bag into the back seat. I climbed in, slammed the door, and locked it. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking as I started the engine. Then, as I looked up, she was standing at the tree line, closer, her head tilted slightly, her hair still covering most of her face. I didn't wait. I threw the car into reverse, backing onto the dirt road, then sped forward as fast as I could without losing control. I didn't look back. Hours later, when I finally reached home, I sat in my car for a long time, thinking. I never found out who she was. I never reported it. What would I even say? All I know is that she was out there, watching, and I don't think she wanted me to leave. I've always enjoyed camping alone. Some people don't get it. They say it's too risky, too lonely, or just plain boring. But for me, being out there in the wild with nothing but my backpack and the sounds of nature is the purest kind of freedom. At least that's what I used to think. It started as just another solo trip. I had picked a remote area in the Pacific Northwest, deep in the woods, miles from any real trails. I had done my research, checked the terrain on maps, and packed for 4 nights. I wanted to push myself to go somewhere few people ever did. That was my first mistake. The hike was harder than I expected. The terrain was steep, and the undergrowth was thick. I followed a game trail most of the way, barely visible in some places, but I had marked my route carefully. I wasn't worried. After a few hours, I reached a small clearing next to a slow-moving stream. It was perfect. Flat ground, water nearby, and just enough space between the trees for a fire. I set up my tent, collected some wood, and got a fire going before sunset. The temperature dropped fast as the sky darkened, but the fire kept me warm. That first night, everything felt normal. The woods were alive with the sounds of insects and distant owl calls. I ate my dinner, enjoyed the quiet, and climbed into my tent. I slept soundly for a while. I woke up in the middle of the night. First, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air was cold. I listened, thinking maybe an animal had wandered too close. Then I heard it. A snap, a single twig breaking. Not close, but not far either. I held my breath. I've been camping enough to know what normal animal sounds are like. Deer are clumsy. Raccoons scurry. Coyotes move fast. This was different. It was slow, deliberate, like a footstep. I lay there, knife in my hand, waiting. Silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had just fallen. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to relax, and eventually, I drifted off again. The next day was quiet. I spent the morning exploring, checking out the stream, and making sure my bearings were right. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake this strange feeling, like something was just off. I ignored it. I spent the rest of the day fishing, cooking, and gathering firewood. By the time night fell, I was exhausted. I went to bed early. I woke up to footsteps, not just one, several. They were close, slow, circling my tent. I didn't move. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. The footsteps stopped, then breathing, right outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. A deep, steady breath. I gripped my knife so hard my hand hurt. Then nothing. No retreating footsteps. No movement. I stayed awake until the sun came up. I stepped outside as soon as it was light. There were footprints in the dirt. Human, barefoot. They circled my tent. I stared at them, my stomach twisting into knots. This wasn't just some hiker who had stumbled into my camp. They had been watching me. I should have left. I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. Maybe I thought I was overreacting. I told myself it was just some weirdo passing through. Unnerving, sure, but not dangerous. I stayed. That evening, I made my fire bigger. Kept my knife in my pocket instead of next to my sleeping bag. I forced myself to eat, even though I had no appetite. As the fire crackled, I felt it again. That feeling of being watched. I turned fast, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I knew something was there. I barely slept. I should have left that morning, but I didn't want to hike back in the dark, and I told myself I was being stupid. That was my second mistake. The sun set, and the forest grew dark. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows through the trees. Then, just past the glow of the flames, I saw it. A figure, standing still, watching. No clothes, no flashlight, just a dark shape against the trees. I didn't move, couldn't. It stood there for what felt like forever. Then slowly it stepped back, fading into the trees. Gone. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going all night. Every time I thought about closing my eyes, I heard things. Branches moving, leaves crunching, footsteps. I sat there, knife in my lap, shaking, waiting. The sun came up, and I was already packed. I left as fast as I could, barely stopping to drink water. Every snap of a branch made my skin crawl. I felt eyes on me the whole way back, but I never saw him again. I don't know who he was. I don't know how long he had been watching me, but I do know one thing. I was never alone out there, and I never will be again. I don't know why I thought camping alone would be a good idea. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I was sick of the noise of the city, the constant distraction of my phone, the never-ending cycle of work and stress. I had seen people talking about solo camping, how it could be peaceful, how it could reset your mind. It sounded like exactly what I needed. So, I packed my gear, threw everything into the back of my car, and drove out to a spot I found online. It was deep in the woods, miles from any main road, but it was supposed to be safe. Other campers had been there before, and the photos online made it look perfect. Just a simple clearing next to a lake, surrounded by thick trees. Quiet, peaceful. It was a long drive, and by the time I arrived, the sun was already getting low. I parked on the dirt road near the entrance of the trail and grabbed my backpack and tent. I had a map, a compass, a flashlight, and even a GPS device just in case. I wasn't stupid. I made sure I had everything I needed. The hike to the campsite was about 2 miles through dense forest. The trees were tall and thick, and once I got about half a mile in, I realized how quiet everything was. There was no traffic noise, no distant hum of people, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt path and the occasional rustling in the bushes. Birds, probably, maybe a squirrel. By the time I got to the site, the sun had dipped below the treetops, and the light was fading fast. I set up my tent quickly, unpacked my sleeping bag, and got a small fire going. I had brought some easy-to-cook food, canned beans, some jerky, a few protein bars. I sat by the fire and ate, staring into the flames as the woods around me darkened. I was alone, completely alone. At first, it felt kind of nice, peaceful. I hadn't checked my phone in hours. I didn't even have a signal out here. It was just me and the wilderness. But then, as the night deepened, that peace started to change. I don't know what it was exactly, but something felt off. The silence wasn't the peaceful kind anymore. It felt too quiet, like something was listening, watching. I shook it off. My mind was just playing tricks on me. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up. The fire outside was still crackling, giving off just enough light to push back the darkness. I lay down, closed my eyes, and tried to sleep. I don't know how long I was out before I woke up. Something had snapped in the woods. A branch breaking. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding. I listened, holding my breath. Silence. Then, another snap. It was close. Too close. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The inside of my tent lit up, but outside, I could only see shadows moving against the fabric. The fire was still burning low, casting flickering shapes across the tent walls. I didn't hear anything else. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon sniffing around for food. I told myself that over and over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then I heard breathing, not my own, right outside the tent. Slow, steady. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. After what felt like forever, I slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, giving off only a faint glow. I shined my flashlight around, but I didn't see anything. I wanted to believe it had been my imagination, but I knew what I heard. Someone or something had been standing right outside my tent. I sat there for a long time, gripping my flashlight, listening to the silence. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I lay back down. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me jolt awake. Morning finally came, and with the first light, my fear started to feel silly. I stepped outside, stretching my sore muscles, and looked around. The woods were normal again. Birds chirping, a soft breeze moving through the trees. It was like nothing had happened. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not animal prints. Human. They circled my tent. And they weren't mine. My stomach dropped. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been out here, watching me. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. My hands were shaking. My skin felt cold despite the morning sun. I needed to get out of there. I started hiking back, moving faster than I should have, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders. The trail felt different now, less like a peaceful escape, more like a trap. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Behind me. I stopped. The footsteps stopped too. I turned. scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. I walked faster. The footsteps followed. I broke into a full sprint, crashing through the woods, barely staying on the trail. My lungs burned. My legs ached. I didn't care. I just needed to get back to my car. I finally saw it, the dirt road, my car sitting right where I left it. I ran straight to it, yanked open the door, and threw myself inside. I locked the doors, my chest heaving, sweat dripping down my face. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm my breathing. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw it. A figure, standing at the tree line, not moving, just watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine, slammed the car into reverse, and sped out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in civilization, back where I could see people, hear cars, feel safe. I never went back. I never even looked up that campsite again. Whatever or whoever was out there that night, I don't want to know. I've always loved camping alone. Something about being completely disconnected from the rest of the world makes me feel alive. Out there, away from the noise and distractions, everything feels simple. No emails, no calls, no people. Just the trees, the wind, and the sound of my own breathing. I had been on plenty of solo trips before, always choosing the most isolated places I could find. This time was no different. I had picked a spot deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest town, with no official trails leading to it. I had found it on an old hiking forum, where experienced campers shared their best-kept secrets. The plan was simple. 3 nights in the woods, completely alone. It was a decision I would regret. The hike in was tough. The terrain was rough, uneven, and overgrown. I had to push through thick brush, climb over fallen trees, and navigate using a map and compass. No phone service, no GPS. That was how I liked it. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The sound of distant traffic had faded long ago. Even the birds seemed to grow silent the farther I hiked. By late afternoon, I reached the spot. A small clearing near a narrow stream, surrounded by dense trees on all sides. No sign that anyone had ever camped there before. Perfect. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and started a fire as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The warm glow of the flames was comforting, pushing back the creeping darkness of the forest. As night fell, the sounds of the woods changed. The distant chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, normal forest sounds. But something felt off. I couldn't explain it. I tried to ignore the feeling, ate my dinner, and let the fire burn down before crawling into my tent. I fell asleep quickly. I woke up to a sound, a snap, like a twig breaking. Close. I held my breath, listening. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest settling, maybe an animal moving through the brush. Then another sound, a slow, deliberate crunch, like a footstep. I lay completely still, my heart pounding. Another crunch. It was close. I reached for the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag, gripping it tightly. Silence again. I waited, listened. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came, and with it, a sense of relief. The daylight made everything feel normal again. Safe. I stepped out of my tent, stretched, and looked around. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They circled my tent. My stomach dropped. I scanned the trees, my eyes searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I told myself it was probably a hunter. Maybe someone passing through, curious about my campsite. But deep down, I knew better. Still, I stayed. I spent the day fishing in the stream, exploring the woods, trying to shake the feeling of unease. It didn't work. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was setting. I rebuilt my fire, cooked dinner, and forced myself to relax. But as the sky darkened, the feeling returned, like I wasn't alone. I sat by the fire long after I normally would have gone to sleep, staring into the flames, listening. The woods were too quiet. Then a noise, a rustling in the trees, just beyond the light of the fire. Not the wind, not an animal, It was slow, careful. I gripped my knife, my whole body tense. The sound moved, circling the camp. I couldn't see anything past the flickering light of the fire, but I knew someone, was there, watching me. I forced myself to stay calm. The fire was my only defense. As long as it burned, I could see, so I fed it more wood, keeping the flames high. The sounds stopped. The feeling of being watched didn't. I stayed awake all night. The first light, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed up quickly, every muscle in my body screaming at me to move faster. The whole time, I felt eyes on me. I started the hike back, my knife in my hand, moving as fast as I could without losing my way. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier, like it wanted me gone. Then I saw it, a tree, with a fresh X carved into the bark. Not there before. My blood ran cold. Someone had marked my path. I didn't stop. I walked faster. Then I smelled it. Smoke. My stomach twisted. I rounded a bend, and there it was, my fire still smoldering. My campsite. I had walked in a circle. Panic surged through me. I checked my compass. The needle spun wildly. Something was wrong. I had been hiking in the right direction. I knew I had, but I was back where I started. And someone had been here while I was gone. The footprints were deeper now, closer to my tent. Couldn't breathe. I forced myself to calm down, to think. I had to get out. Now, I tried again. Slower this time, focusing on every step. Hours passed. Finally, I saw the road. My truck. I almost cried. I ran the last stretch, yanked open the door, and got inside, locking it behind me. My hands shook as I started the engine. It roared to life. Then I saw it. Something on my windshield. A single, deep X scratched into the glass. I didn't think. I just drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I don't know who was out there. I don't know how they managed to lead me back to my own camp. But they weren't lost. They knew those woods, and they didn't want me there. I haven't camped alone since, and I never will again. Camping alone was something I did often. It wasn't about proving anything to myself or anyone else. It was about peace. The world felt too loud sometimes, too demanding, too fast. Out in the wilderness, there were no texts, no emails, no deadlines. Just me, my gear, and the quiet. I had been solo camping for years, taking longer and longer trips, testing myself. The more remote, the better. The fewer people around, the more I could breathe. I had no way of knowing this trip would be my last. I chose a location deep in a national forest, miles away from the nearest road. It was a place I found through online forums, one of those spots serious hikers talk about but never post on maps. No official trails led there. The only way in was by navigating old game trails, using a compass and a good sense of direction. It was perfect. I planned for 3 nights. I packed my usual gear, tent, sleeping bag, enough food to last, a water filter, a small hatchet, and my knife. I always carried a GPS for emergencies, but I preferred navigating the old-fashioned way. I also had my sidearm. I never had to use it, but it gave me peace of mind. I drove 5 hours to the closest access point, parked on the side of a dirt road, and started my hike. The hike in was brutal. Steep inclines, thick undergrowth, fallen logs. No easy paths. The air was warm, but deep in the forest, the trees blocked most of the sun, casting long shadows. The farther I went, the quieter it got. I reached my campsite in the late afternoon. It was a clearing near a narrow stream, flat enough for my tent and close enough to water for easy refills. No signs of other campers, no footprints, no fire pits. Exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and started a fire as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The first night of a trip was always the best. No thoughts of packing up, no worries about the hike back, just the feeling of being completely alone. As darkness settled, I noticed something. The forest had gone silent. No wind, no insects, no distant rustling, just the crackling of my fire. It wasn't the normal stillness of the woods at night. It was dead quiet, like the trees themselves were listening. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing. I had camped alone enough times to know that sometimes the woods just felt strange. Still, I kept my knife close when I crawled into my tent. I didn't sleep well. I woke up sometime after midnight. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it. A snap. A twig breaking. Close. My whole body tensed. I held my breath, listening. Another sound. A slow, deliberate crunch. A footstep. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too careful. I stayed completely still, my hand gripping my knife. The sound came again. Closer. Then silence. Minutes passed. I lay there, staring at the dark fabric of my tent, listening, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. Morning came, bringing with it the comfort of daylight. I unzipped my tent, stepped outside, and my stomach dropped. There were footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They circled my tent. My skin went cold. I scanned the trees, heart pounding. Nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone. I had two choices: pack up and leave or stay and brush it off. I should have left, but I told myself it was probably a hunter passing through. Maybe they saw my fire, got curious, and walked around my tent before moving on. I convinced myself it was no big deal. Big mistake. I spent the day exploring, hiking further into the forest. But the whole time, the feeling of being watched never left. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just trees. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was setting. I rebuilt my fire, ate, and tried to relax. It didn't work. I stayed up late, staring into the fire, listening. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, closer this time. I gripped my knife, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows. I strained my eyes, scanning the trees. Nothing. Then another step. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone was there, standing, watching. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. Then, finally, I forced myself to move. I grabbed more wood, threw it on the fire, and let the flames grow higher. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. I didn't sleep that night. To first light, I packed up, fast. I didn't eat, didn't even boil water. I just wanted to get out. The feeling of being watched never left. Every step, every turn, I expected to see someone. The woods felt different now, darker, heavier. I moved fast, barely stopping for water. 3 miles from my truck, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A tree carved with a single, deep X. Fresh, the bark still raw. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I walked faster. Then I smelled it. Smoke. My chest tightened. I broke into a jog. As I reached the last stretch of the trail, my truck came into view, and my stomach dropped. The driver's side window was shattered. Glass on the ground. The door was open. Inside, my glove compartment had been ripped open. Everything dumped out, but nothing was taken, just searched. My keys were still there under the seat where I always kept them. Hands shaking, I grabbed them, jumped in, and locked the doors. I turned the ignition. The engine stalled. Panic surged through me. I tried again. The engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I threw it into drive and peeled out of there, tires kicking up gravel. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but they weren't just passing through. They had been watching me, waiting, and if I had stayed one more night, I don't want to think about it. I haven't been camping alone since, and I never will again. I've always liked camping alone. It's not that I hate people. I just prefer the quiet. The kind of quiet you only get miles away from the nearest road, deep in the wilderness where the only sounds are your own footsteps and the wind moving through the trees. I had done it dozens of times before. A few days, sometimes a week, off-grid with no phone service, just me and my gear. It was my way of resetting. But after my last trip, I don't do solo camping anymore. I had a 3-day weekend coming up, and I wanted to make the most of it. I picked a spot in a national forest a few hours away. I'd been there once before, but only on a short-day hike. This time, I planned to go deeper, off the marked trails, far enough that I wouldn't see another person the entire trip. I packed light but smart. My tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a water filter, my knife, a small hatchet, and a GPS. I also carried a map and compass as a backup. I reached the trailhead around noon, parked my truck in a small gravel lot, and set off into the woods. The hike was beautiful. Thick pines, patches of golden grass, the occasional burst of color from wildflowers. The sun was warm, but the shade from the trees kept it cool. I followed an old game trail, barely visible, winding deeper into the forest. After about 6 miles, I found the perfect spot. A small clearing near a slow-moving stream. Flat ground, plenty of dry wood for a fire, and no signs that anyone had camped there before. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire as the sun dipped behind the trees. That's when I noticed it. The silence. I don't mean regular quiet. I mean dead quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant animal sounds, just my fire crackling. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was normal. Sometimes the woods get like that. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping into my gut. I ate a quick meal, stretched out by the fire, and listened. Still nothing. Eventually, I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay there, staring at the fabric. My knife was next to me just in case. I told myself I wasn't scared. I was wrong. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate crunch. A footstep. I froze. It wasn't the quick, darting sound of an animal. It was slow, careful, human. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch. Closer. Then nothing. The silence stretched. I lay there, every muscle in my body locked. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. I never heard anything else. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was just on edge from being alone in the dark. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up to soft morning light filtering through the tent. For a moment, everything felt normal again. The uneasiness from the night before felt like a bad dream. I unzipped the tent, stepped outside, and froze. Footprints. Not mine. They circled my tent. My stomach dropped. I knelt down, studying them. They were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt. A single pair of boots. Someone had been here, watching me. I scanned the woods, my heart hammering. Nothing. Just endless trees. I had a decision to make. Pack up and leave or stay one more night. I should have left, but I told myself it was probably just a lost hiker passing through. Maybe they saw my tent and walked around it, curious. I forced myself to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Big mistake. I spent the day hiking further out, exploring, trying to enjoy myself. But the whole time I felt watched, like there were eyes in the trees, just out of sight. The feeling never went away. That night, I built my fire bigger than before. The light made me feel safer. It didn't help. I sat by the fire long after I normally would have gone to bed, listening. Every time the fire popped, I jumped. Then, somewhere in the darkness, a snap, a branch breaking, close, too close. I gripped my knife, staring into the trees. The firelight didn't reach far enough to see anything. Silence. Then another crunch. Slow, deliberate. I wasn't alone. I stayed there, frozen for what felt like hours. The fire burned lower. My eyes started to droop. I didn't want to go into the tent, but eventually exhaustion won. I zipped myself inside, knife in my hand. I told myself it would be okay. I was wrong. I woke up to the sun rising. For a brief, blissful moment, I forgot where I was. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't just around my tent this time. They led away, back toward the trailhead, back to my truck. My stomach twisted. Whoever had been watching me had left before dawn. I packed my gear in record time, barely stopping to eat. I moved fast, heart pounding the whole way. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. I was 2 miles from my truck when I saw it. A shape, far ahead, just off the trail. Standing, watching, a man, tall, still. I didn't stop. I walked faster. He didn't move. As I got closer, my breath caught in my throat. He was wearing a mask, not a horror movie mask. Something homemade, rough, animal-like. A deer skull? No, something smaller, distorted. I gripped my knife, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't look away. I kept moving. 30 feet, 20. Then he stepped back, melted into the trees. Gone. I ran the last mile. When I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I locked the doors, turned the engine over, and peeled out of there, kicking up gravel. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know how long he was out there, watching me, and I don't want to know. I haven't been camping alone since, and I never will again.